Hi everyone. In this video series I'm going to be showing you the foundations of planet editing and how to use the SimpleRockets2 Planet Studio, a tool for the design of custom celestial bodies and stellar systems. In episode 2 we looked at the celestial body templates which are available in Planet Studio. We introduced noise seed randomization, frequency and crater curves. In this episode we'll build on these topics by focusing on the parametrical elements of the celestial body designer. By the end of the video we will have covered metadata, quality modes, atmospheres, water and rings, all features found in the left-hand panel of the designer. Now, there is a lot to cover in this episode, so please bear in mind that I'll only be looking at the absolute basics here. A full understanding of all of the tools that we'll be looking at can only be gained through experimenting and trying stuff out for yourself. The first thing we'll be looking at is the Properties tab. Although these metadata inputs might seem the most boring part of creating a planet, it is really important to get these right to prevent mixing up your work. Fully utilising these tools will also improve workflow efficiency. For bodies which are designed for website sharing, the description and the version number are critical. The metadata tools are identical in the Planetary System Designer, so all the information here can be carried over to system editing too. There are some hidden metadata properties which can only be tweaked through XML, and an example of this are the music tags which control which tracks of the game's music will be played in the vicinity of the body. Planet Studio and SimpleRockets2 website are capable of version control of up to 4 integers. If you upload a replacement celestial body or system with a higher version number, players using your system will automatically be prompted by the game that updates are available to their sandbox after installing it. The version tag, which is probably more useful when working with systems, provides a user-friendly way to differentiate systems or bodies that may share the name but are meant to be quite different, so they don't prompt an update message to the users in the wrong sandbox. This final metadata field is the description. It is of course very obvious what this is for, however it is quite unique in that this description will appear when loading the celestial body in Planet Studio, and it will also be the default description for a website upload. A concise but interesting description will go a long way to gaining more community interest in a celestial body. It is possible to change the description for the website post, and as we haven't covered uploading bodies or systems yet, it's probably a convenient time to show you how this is done. Going to the main menu and then pressing the Upload button brings up this dialog, Upload Celestial Body. Here we can input the name, edit the description if we wish, use the screenshot tool or upload a thumbnail and then add optional screenshots. You can then finally change the account and set whether it will be public or unlisted. Going back to the Properties tab, the next section of the properties controls the most fundamental specifications of a celestial body. Correctly tuning these can make a huge difference to the overall feel of a planet when it's loaded in-game, as we will demonstrate shortly. Radius is the first property in this box, and although it is simple, there are a couple of easy mistakes to make here. The first is that this figure is in meters, so take care that the number being inputted is actually to the correct order of magnitude, or the planet will be 1,000 times smaller or larger than intended. In addition, when making replicas of real-life bodies, you may find that some internet sources and even books can be a little unclear whether they're using radius or diameter. It may seem painfully obvious, but I have personally made this mistake several times and ended up with completely the wrong size for the body, an error which was then carried into the terrain design and wasted a lot of time. A very good way to sanity check for planet size is to use the altitude readouts, which we looked at in the first episode, over in the celestial body box. By looking at the above ground level and above sea level values, you can begin to get a bit of a perspective for how large the body could be. The next input is surface gravity, which is measured in meters per second squared, or acceleration. It's about as intuitive as anything gets in Planet Studio, but it does have a big influence on how crafts or druids will behave on the surface, and also how craft orbits will work in the sphere of influence. The game also provides an interesting tool to help with scaling gravity as radius is changed. It is enabled or disabled using this auto-update gravity switch. Remember that this is essentially based off an average density, so each template's gravity will respond differently when its radius is changed. For example, the lunar template has more density than one of the icy world templates. Personally, I recommend researching real-life bodies and their gravity values to get a ballpark figure, entering it here for gravity based off the radius that you've chosen. Then, and only then, rely on the auto-update to give you the exact value of G as you tweak the planet's size. Another slider here has terrain physics. Now, this is always left on for terrestrial planets, but for gas giant planets, disabling the terrain physics is a good way to reduce performance requirements and also to prevent unwanted behaviour like debris from the crush altitude, which we'll look at shortly, lying down on top of the clouds. By disabling this option, the craft will be unable to drive on the surface and crafts will be unable to interact with it, so the craft will fall through it as if it wasn't there. Finally, fade skybox during daytime. This is probably another quite self-explanatory feature, but it's best demonstrated through launching a craft onto the planet. Let's go ahead and do this. Remembering from our first episode, snapping the camera to the ground, checking that yes, we are indeed on the ground here. We have fade skybox during daytime. Let's launch our craft. So here you can see we've been launched into the main game user interface. Now currently the skybox is very dark, so this is a clear indicator that the skybox fading is indeed in effect. If we fast forward the game using warp speed, watching the sun go down, and finally we can see that the skybox has illuminated in the night time. It is just worth bearing in mind that this feature isn't always the best choice for some bodies, for example ones with very small diameters. When orbiting or taking off from the surface, these can begin to look a little bit messy when using fade skybox. Also, bodies with very short daytimes, it will flash on and off in quite an unpleasant way. Let's walk back to daytime to demonstrate another couple of things here. So as you're all aware, the way that buggies and other crafts and druids behave on the different planets is quite different, and this is a result of gravity. Increasing that gravity value will make it far easier to drive around and explore the surface, but for a small body that can result in quite an inauthentic feel. So you definitely want to get quite a balance between allowing the player to easily explore the terrain, but also making it feel more realistic. This is just another good example of the constant compromise that you have to make when designing planets between realism or inspiration and what the player will actually be wanting to experience. Let's go back into the Planet Studio user interface. Back across to the properties, the final thing that we'll be looking at here are the terrain quality modes. Now these settings may seem a bit scary or hard to understand at first, but they really aren't that complicated. To render planets in the game, the grid or quad sphere is produced on a cube, which is then deformed to match the sphere or the shape of the planet. Each face of the cube is called a quad, and each quad is divided in sections to make the terrain. The terrain vertices define how many times each quad is cut. Different planets on the same system should always have the same terrain vertices number. Water vertices can either match this value or be half of it. So we see here full or half. But when halving it in planets with large water masses, there can be some quite nasty visual effects from orbit. The minimum and maximum subdivisions determine how much detail the terrain gets based on how far the player is from the terrain. Keep in mind that these subdivisions are based on where the player is and not on where the camera is. You've probably experienced this when your craft is on the surface or in a very low orbit and you've zoomed out and panned the camera around. Despite the fact that you might move the camera close to terrain on the other side of the planet, it will still look quite nasty. That's a very different experience to what you get in the Planet Studio, for example, where the subdivisions are clearly loaded based on the camera's distance from the terrain. Minimum subdivisions affect the amount of detail when the player is far from the surface. Increasing this value can have a very big impact in GPU and memory usage, with values above 5 risking crashing the game. Increasing this value to 4, we can see here, from distance, the amount of detail shown is a bit higher. We could change it to 5 or 6, but my laptop would be quite unhappy, so we won't do that. Maximum subdivisions define the detail that the terrain is going to have when the player is very close to it, and an estimated value for the resolution can be seen underneath the water vertices output. As you may have noticed, there's an automatic toggle which will adjust the settings to match a specific inputted target resolution, but in most cases it's recommended to tweak the values manually to get the best results. And just to quickly demonstrate that, setting the max subdivisions to 12 here will result in the estimated resolution being enhanced. Finally, a toggle to enable or disable the quad sphere loading distances hides two text boxes with number inputs that allow the player to change when the scaled space starts to show and how long the transition distance is. Remembering back to episode 1, scaled space are the image textures which the game generates to replace the quad sphere at either great distances or in the map view to save on performance. By default, these two values are set to the diameter of the planet, that is, 2 times this radius. With all of these quality modes, remember that reducing the resolution and the overall detail will increase the performance, but it will also compromise quality for players on higher end devices. Even if you're building a planet with your own settings below max, make sure that you do have a good range of detail across each of these modes, so that players on all devices have a good experience. It's recommended to use settings as close to the stock system or these templates as possible, with minimum subdivisions being kept at 3 and water vertices set to full across all settings. Terrain vertices are recommended to be 25, 19 and 13 for each quality mode, and tweaking the maximum subdivisions to get between 10 and 20 meters is recommended. Next, let's look at the Atmospheres tab. Now there is a lot to unpack here. At the top of the tab are the general atmosphere properties. The Has Atmosphere switch enables or disables the atmosphere physics and shaders. For bodies like Luna, for example, the atmosphere generation can be entirely skipped by disabling it. To demonstrate some more of these properties, let's load up the Martian template. Back now to the Atmospheres tab. The next property that we'll be looking at is crush altitude, which controls the altitude above sea level at which the player's craft will be destroyed. This feature is commonly used on gas giants, as we mentioned earlier, and stars, and it allows terrain physics to be disabled without it being noticed by a player. Another interesting use of the destruction altitude is for lava lakes, where it can be set a few centimetres below or above the level of the lava. However, just do bear in mind that a crush altitude of 0 by default disables the feature, so don't set it to 0 unless you're building a body with no crush altitude. In the game, atmospheres are dealt with in two parts: physics and shaders or visuals. We need to be careful to approach the two separately, but also make sure that the two components match up to create a believable and immersive user experience. Let's first of all look at these atmosphere physics. The atmosphere height gives a good indicator of the overall atmosphere physics. This value live updates as changes are made to the other parameters found in this section. As the atmosphere physics can't actually be seen, this is the best way to monitor its status. Atmospheres are held in balance by two opposing forces, gravity and thermal motion of the atmospheric molecules. From basic chemistry, we know that the average energy of a gas is its temperature, so by increasing these temperatures in the atmosphere, the energy of the molecules is increased, resulting in it gaining more height. Conversely, if the temperature is reduced, or the gravity value, back in the properties, were to be increased, the atmosphere's height will reduce. In addition, the effect of gravity on each molecule in the atmosphere can be changed. This is accomplished with the mean molecular weight slider. Personally, I find a more correct term to use for this is molar mass. It gives the mass of 1 mole of atmosphere molecules in grams. By increasing this value, the atmosphere's height is reduced. And by reducing this value, the atmosphere's height is increased. In its most basic model, the density of the atmosphere decays exponentially with altitude as a result of these temperatures and this mean molecular weight. Now, this does result in the atmosphere physics never reaching a density of true zero. Of course, in real life, this apparent paradox is not an issue because the space between bodies has some energized gas in it. But in SimpleRockets2, a fade distance is used to get around the issue. It allows a clearly defined altitude at which the atmosphere physics end, letting crafts remain in orbit and run fast when skipping drag and lift calculations in the game's engine. The fade distance makes the density decay linearly for a set height, in meters, reaching a value of true zero at the final atmosphere height. So we can imagine here this height of 58.8 kilometers. For the last 5,000 meters of this, the density will decay linearly. So you might see a slightly quicker fall off, and then it will turn to true zero outside the atmosphere. Let's now conclude our discussion of the atmosphere physics with a couple of parameters that don't directly change the height but do impact the behaviour. Surface air density is the first of these, and as the name suggests, it controls the density of the air at zero sea level. Data from real-life celestial bodies is very useful when choosing a good value. For example, air density on Earth is roughly 1.2 grams per cubic meters. Due to the game physics engine limitations, high densities can cause wings to break apart or accelerate at high speeds, so it's recommended to keep it under 20 kilograms per cubic meters. Another slightly less understood parameter is mean gamma. This is the ratio of specific heats for the atmospheric gas if you're interested to research it more. But put simply, this value is used in calculating the speed of sound and hence the Mach number at a given speed. It's also used in governing aerodynamic heating. So reducing gamma will increase the Mach number at any given velocity and increase heating effects. Small changes to gamma can provide the immersive final tweaks to an atmosphere's behaviour, so while I don't suggest you go overboard with changing it, don't be afraid to try some slightly different values in here. Next, let's move on to the atmosphere visuals. These aren't connected to the physics, so they need to be set up separately. The behaviours of the different sliders and inputs are better demonstrated than explained, so let's just quickly look at a couple of them and see what effect they might have on the celestial body's atmosphere. Let's move the camera around using the controls that we learned in the first episode to get a clearer view of the edge of the atmosphere. The sky section of the shaders are applied to the actual atmosphere. That is the wavelength colour, which changes the colour of the atmosphere. Note that this has the effect opposite on the colour gradient, so just bear that in mind. The wavelength magnitude, which changes the overall magnitude of the light entering the atmosphere. The sun brightness, which has a very similar effect, but is a little bit more subtle. I prefer to use this and leave wavelength magnitude at 1. My scattering, which simulates the effect of larger particles in the atmosphere. This has more effect at sunrise and sunset. Rayleigh scattering, which overall changes the general scattering properties of the atmosphere. This simulates small particles, for example the individual gas molecules. And finally, one which isn't often used, symmetry scattering. This is used to simulate how the atmosphere will respond to light coming in at a very low illumination angle. Finally, the height scale, which changes how diffuse the atmosphere visuals appear. This is probably the value which I use the most, experimentally testing using the above ground level or sea level values to match up the height of the visuals that we see here with the height of the physics. Finally, the lerp scale depth, which I won't cover in detail here, but it essentially allows you to control how bright the atmosphere visuals will look from space or from the surface. In addition, the maximum colour value, which allows you to clip the brightness of the atmosphere. Some quite interesting things that you can do with that. For the terrain section, all the parameters are the same as previous, but they are applied to the surface of the body and not the sky. Matching the terrain and sky visuals is clearly an important thing to do, or it will look quite unpleasant, and a good starting point is applying the same settings to the sky and terrain and then tweaking the values from there individually. This can be done easily by using the third option, the both section. The key thing to note in the terrain section are these additional colour inputs. These are the ambient light colour inputs, and they're values that affect the light around of a craft independent of the position of the parent star. Leaving these black during the day would make the shadows very dark, something which, as you can imagine, is quite realistic in bodies without atmospheres, but would make a more unnatural feeling in ones like, in this case, Solero, which have them. The most useful part of this feature, though, is that having a non-black value set at night, for example, will help players see in the dark, making the gaming experience much more pleasant. Let's now move on from the atmospheres to water. In order to demonstrate this well, we'll load up the ocean template. Now we can see here the first section of this is very similar to the atmosphere. The has water slider enables or disables this, and the sea level value changes the altitude from the radius at which the sea level occurs. Now there are so many different parameters in the water tab that it really is impossible for me to cover them all in detail. As with the shaders, most of these are sliders. Most of them will either live update or change after rebuilding the body. So I really encourage you to investigate all of the options in detail by loading a template such as this water one and editing them one at a time. At this point, Pedro also wanted to stress that the tooltips really are a good source of information, and I'd also argue that if you haven't already got into the habit of reading these tooltips as you encounter them, you really should start doing this now. As with all previous episodes in this series, I can't look in detail at everything, but I rather want to give you a strong foundation in the basics. You can see these are all laid out into quite intuitive and helpful sections, affecting first the color gradients, specularity, metallicness, emissiveness, etc. Then the texturing, the reflections, transparency, which will be applied to the top surface of the water, foam, which will show with the interactions of the water with terrain or with your craft, the waves, which are quite an exciting feature, the underwater visuals. Remembering back to view those underwater visuals, we need to turn this value on and then rebuild. So you can see here we've got a very dark colour applied, and as we can see on the camera, we do indeed have a very dark colour applied. The colour intensity, the light fade depth, distance, and then for the more brave, the advanced tiling configuration, which is very useful, and although it looks a bit daunting, it really is quite intuitive and simple. Just go through looking at all of these tooltips, changing values a bit at a time until you get a good idea of what this is all doing. The final thing that we'll look at in this video are rings. Now, customizable rings are one of the coolest features in Planet Studio in my opinion. They're generated by revolving a simple texture file around the planet's center point. The ring texture is a linear cross-section of the rings at any one point, and suitable files can be generated in most digital art suites. Normally the file has a very high aspect ratio, and it's perfectly acceptable to produce a texture of just 1 pixel high to save on memory and performance. But with this, a couple of notes: make sure that there is transparency, i.e. you're using the alpha channel in the file, and also don't try to initially create a 1 pixel image, as it's impossible to see what's going on in such a picture. So just to recap, to load in this texture, all that we did was click in this box, press add, navigated to the file that we wanted, and loaded it into the game. It will then have taken this file, put it into the folders deep into the game, the generated data one, and it will have applied this hex key to it and will have formatted it all ready for us to load into the game. The rings won't show up until you've rebuilt, so just remember to use the rebuild button here. And now you can see that these quite nice rings have been applied to the moon. By altering the inner and outer radius, these are just simple multipliers of the initial radius that you put in. The geometry of the wings can really be changed quite a lot. For example, here we can make the rings a lot narrower, or we can go ahead and make them very broad and extensive. Of course, the more you stretch the rings, they may appear to get some pixelation or loss of quality to them. So it's worth considering how you'll size your image texture depending on the size of the body and how you'll be stretching it out across these radii. Also, the rotation here can be changed in all 3 angles of the spherical coordinates to produce some quite interesting results. Of course, remember that one of these will simply rotate the rings around themselves, which won't result in any change. Now, this has been quite an information-packed video, so we'll stop here for this episode of Planet Studio tutorial. As a quick recap, We looked at celestial body properties like the diameter or radius, the surface gravity, the name, version, and version tag, and description. We also looked at uploading bodies or systems to the website. We then looked at the quality modes and in some detail at the atmosphere physics and how they're simulated in Planet Studio. We then reviewed atmosphere visuals in the form of sky, terrain, and both shaders. Next, we very briefly looked at the water tab and the many varied tools for creating bodies of liquid on Planet's surfaces. Finally, I introduced the Rings tab and discussed loading in the file and how to generate it. In the next episode, we'll be exploring the Structures tab. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.